Alright, everyone. Sorry for the delay in videos. Just been kind of up and down with my life, as a lot of people have, and just haven't really had the mojo to actually make a video. So hopefully this will make up. So, I said, so on the topic of submariners, that's definitely a very interest. That's kind of a somewhat vague category because, in theory, you could have the ability to breathe underwater through various many things, such as if you were a shapeshifter and like maybe animals like Beast Boy, he can breathe underwater just fine just by turning into say any animal that has gills. So that is it, but that's not the only thing he can do. I mean, it seems like if you're from the new from basically the Aquaman movies, it seems as though that unless you're half Atlantean or even have, some kind of royal title, you can't breathe on water and you can't really do much of anything. Because it seems as though that you put, Jason Momoa's version of, Aquaman on land, he can still definitely fight you pretty well and not even, seems like he doesn't have a problem. Or even the fact when he was on this submarine taking down Black Manta's father, and he was just kind of standing there, and with said armored skin. It just doesn't really seem like he's burdened by the same, can't go out of water for very long. Um, it just seems like just even just being if the wrong people are in a very dry place, even barely in humidity. It seems like it's an asthma attack. It's like maybe there is some way you can survive for, brief amount of time, like holding your breath, but you kind of do need to have water every so often, kind of like when the guy actually dunked himself in the toilet. So, but said other things could always be a little bit more complicated, even in the real world, because like the Christmas Island red crabs, they technically have gills that they have to keep moist, but it's essentially all they're really just doing is like the air is just kind of washing over them, and that's how they get it. So it's not like the true is said they have other ways of kind of sifting through. And if anyone's ever seen like an axolotl, all they really have to do is said they don't actually breathe as much like through their mouths. Um, all they just really kind of do is just flex their little. I said there's little. They said their little wings are actually gills, because you can call them fins, and that's pretty much showing them that they're breathing. So there could be other ways of taking everything um, through that. I mean, electric eels, they can definitely stay submerged for a good while, but essentially they actually have a whole bunch of blood vessels in their mouths that allow them to essentially, gulp air from the surface every so often. So, just because you said you look like you're, dependent on water does not always mean anything. Then again, um, I said, look at certain sea snakes. They can actually stay, they can get a good gulp of air and stay underwater for hours. And that's actually due to the fact that they're cold blooded. They don't have to provide energy for everything. So the oxygen can just stay in them, so much longer if they choose, if they choose. So, and now it's just kind of so, but if you're talking about someone who is, half human, half fish, you really can't, stay underwater. You said you have to pretty much be bound to water, and there could be some differences between if you're a freshwater breather as opposed to, a saltwater breather, because the salt will definitely cause some issues with you drying out, and even if you can kind of go for a while, it's like being around something that is either very smelly or being like out in the heat for too long. You might be able to last for a little while, but then eventually it's like, you know what, I can't do this anymore. It said, get me out of here. So and it just seems as though that, if you're near like, a lot of heat, that could definitely cause things to dry out very quickly. Um, it said no humidity, because they actually showed like in Ben 10, his alien rip jaws, he essentially could go on water, it said on land, but periodically he had to basically just splash himself with water, almost like he just had to keep his gills wet, kind of like the kind of like the Christmas Island crabs, and then eventually they showed that there was a key to the universe hidden on their world, and the only way to get there is to pretty much be, in a place with no water whatsoever. So they think, the only people that might try to cause issues would be where they said would actually would be aquatic based themselves. So it just seems as though that, if you pretty much cannot even take a few um, breaths of air without causing issues, that's a problem, or you're just not built for it. So last thing you want to do is, try to think that the water is, going to be perfectly helpful, for like some kind of mission, but you can't really do anything. And even just like the fact of maybe you're just a person that can go underwater, but they get really, really thirsty and they can't really do much because the supers have someone called like Splashdown. He was one of the guys. He was the guy that would suck down a vortex, and they say like in the DVD commentary that he can fly and travel pretty well underwater, but he has to keep extremely hydrated. They never really explored him, very much to show why that actually was, but just the fact that maybe it's like when people sweat way too much, you will literally lose so much water weight over time, and if you don't replace it, that's not a good thing, just which is in this case a big problem, like people who are stranded out in like the desert. Apparently you're more likely to die if you ration your water rather than drinking it. And for me, I'm just thinking, just find a place to hunker down for a while, take simple sips, and then wait for nightfall. It's something that simple. So that's definitely, a thing. But then again, there are different kinds, you know, of submariners. I mean, look at actually Namor or Namor, or however you pronounce him, the Submariner, who was the inspiration for Aquaman, just one of those ones that was stolen in the fact that he can technically go up on water, but he's essentially meant to drain like a battery way too quickly. Um, when he's on dry land, it might as well be the equivalent of essentially having very cheap batteries, and you're trying to play a Sega Nomad. I mean, you'll be gone in no time. And yet, in this case, he does have the ability to fly with those little wings that he has on his legs. So that really doesn't seem to make much sense when a lot of submariners tend to just be able to fly underwater. At least it looks like they can't really. They're just doing it. It's not like they're not actively swimming. Said like others, maybe you might see. It said maybe the occasional flutter. That might actually just be the fact that it could be conserving energy, but it's pretty much the same thing. They actually showed like in the Justice League when Superman, Wonder Woman, and Green Lantern were encountering Aquaman for the first time, they seemed to be able to just fly around like there was no big deal. So in theory, it's just like if your body's just used to being under there, it's you have all the buoyancy you need. It's so it's pretty much the same thing. But you said, but like what I said with actually in flight, there are some other issues with that. And that would be that the farther you go down, you're going to be losing light. So you're going to need, say, you're going to need some kind of source of your own, or hope that maybe you have some kind of weird fish vision that compensates for everything rather than just making your own light so that you can kind of move around and be stealthy. It's going to get very cold when you go down there. Just places that may not get the greatest amount of light, or in a place where warm water really isn't a thing. Um, and in this case, it just seems as though that as as the hot, basically any warmth rises while everything else, the cold actually sinks. In this case, it just seems like it doesn't wouldn't have a chance to even get down to anything. And then there's actually the issue with pressure. Um, Essentially, all that weight on you is definitely not going to be a good thing. You may not be able to handle everything. It might as well be the equivalent of essentially being very fat and not able to move around as much because your body is isn't just used to doing all that. And like I said, and essentially, they pretty much talk about how when like submarines and submersible like submarines kind of go down far, they actually start to compress, and they just can't. In this case, you can't really just have a massive shape um, going down. That's why you have submersibles that are very small, but you could possibly only go down very far, like maybe somewhat of a decompression diver, where they really don't seem like they go down super, super far. It's just the problem is that maybe, having, needing the decompression is something, so that's definitely another issue. So if you're perfectly able at it, said fine, that is there. But if you're essentially actually breathing the water, um, there is the equivalent of basically poor oxygen environments down there. There's just isn't enough oxygen, for everything to be there. It's like there are creatures that seem to be able to survive with either barely any oxygen or to possibly none of them, like some of those gigantic worms. Um, and essentially, is that they do need to actually breathe. And so they are essentially getting oxygen from everything and taking it in them. So without some kind of, so if you're essentially, have to actually absorb said everything, like to basically refuel like an oxygen tank. You said you have to essentially leave wherever you go and just go up, extremely high. You go up a little bit higher, and that's what you have to do, because it's almost as though we hardly know much actually about the bottom of the ocean, and that's probably. And if we could essentially get down there and scan, for signs of life, you may not really find, too much, below a certain depth. And even there is kind of like the equivalent, like deep sea giantism, where it seems as though that the bigger they are, so they said animals seem to be much bigger than you possibly would think they should be down there, and that's just basically trying to keep themselves, alive as long as possible, and they're just able to use it because the ocean is literally just instead of way too vast, and everything has to be pushed down at some point. So, oops, sorry. So essentially, it really isn't meant. I said not everything is meant to be, at the total bottom of the ocean, like Marianas Trench or other massive, I said other trenches, kind of like when they showed like in the Atlantis movie that Disney made. They may not have actually been too far down when they actually entered um, the Leviathan's territory, and then essentially, it may not have been like super far down, but there's not really, they never really said anything. And then, because you never know what might even happen. And, if you have to actually rescue people, that's going to be an issue. But then, I actually remember, like in the movie The Sphere, there was actually a moment where the guy said, it kind of would put everything into perspective, saying, so we're only about 1,000 feet down. If you wanted to take a quick dip, the pressure wouldn't get you, but it's actually the insane amount of, you know, cold, the insane cold of the ocean. It's just the fact that they were in a very dark place, and it's a very dark place. Made it seem as though it was nighttime, so there really isn't any way to get heat down there, and just makes it seem as though that it was borderline, like freezing as it is, because it said because that's whatever it is, but you may not really acknowledge it because salt water has a different freezing temperature than regular fresh water. That's why when they actually had like the series, the last ship, and they were running on some awkward power issues, when they actually had to stop, they would essentially drop, a lot of medical research samples, down into the ocean where it would get into that safe, like cold zone. So, and anyone who's ever, randomly stuck their hands in like said water that's just above freezing, he said it could be perfectly clean. There's like no trace of ice whatsoever. It's not exactly going to feel very good. So you gotta basically compensate for that. So And then another kind of attributes that seem to always kind of come with being a submariner is kind of like talking to fish or some type of telepathy because um, the act of actually talking underwater seems to be impossible, because you actually have to have, vocal cords vibrating with air to actually talk. So, it's definitely one thing to basically be able to, communicate with people close by, but then again, you have to control your thoughts. Um, so you don't want to actually, spoil someone's birthday surprise or say something really offensive, just by the sheer happenstance. And even then, you say even controlling, you're basically trying to summon, sea life to actually help you. The question is, what exactly is around you, and what exactly are they capable of doing? Because while in this case sharks are definitely potent, creatures, um, not every shark could actually survive, just standing still. That's why you're never going to see a great white shark in, an aquarium because they essentially have to have something constantly flowing through them. And if you're talking about just a regular shark trying to take a bite out of like some type advanced underwater robot, you're just going to be knocking, their teeth out. It's not going to do much. Maybe in this, you're more likely to have like versions of like whales, essentially giving off massive screeches to disorient things. Because like the sperm whale is like one of the loudest things, on the said Earth, and essentially, just being in the water, could actually liquefy it into your insides if they basically start clicking way too much. So you never know what you might be getting yourself into. It's like yes, here's, maybe summoning a few fish to actually spy on something, but the fish are basic feeder fish. You need something a little bit bigger, but if like whatever your enemy is there, it's like, huh, those fish don't normally come over this way and seen this casually. And then if it's like they realize they've been spied and run away too quickly, that might be an issue. But there is definitely one very unique power that, if it's actually used against someone, would be truly devastating. That would be cavitation bubbles, which is essentially you create this massive bubble that is like moves a little too quickly and kind of creates a vacuum. So essentially creates, water practically boils and has lightning. These are often associated with, the mantis shrimps that have very quick, punches, and then there's also something called like a pistol shrimp, where all it really does is just kind of like squeezes its, one of its pincers, creates a bubble, and then when that thing pops, it's like a sonic boom, and it can disorient a lot of things. And they actually showed something like that in Batman versus Superman when basically Aquaman was trying to leave that thing. It was almost like he essentially used that to actually power him, because in theory it's like you're basically removing all the pressure, from the world that could, propel you at an insane amount. There's even possible talk of actually using something like that for better propulsion underwater. So that could definitely help you, and be kind of nice to actually see, go underwater, maybe find lost items in places. But what said, you just really don't know what's down there on your own. You could find like pollution, way too much pollution. Maybe in this case, like if you ever touch the bottom of a lake that pretty much has a bunch of sludge, that's from everything of like dead leaves like building up, that might actually have an effect on the water. So it's almost as though it's like if you're in the water, you smell everything, and that could definitely become a problem. So definitely, I would say that if you are a submariner, you have to be other things as well. It's just you have the options or just that other set of skills to actually go in the water and say in the water, say yes, I can do this. You know, it's kind of like how Superman can definitely move around pretty good. Lantern Corps, they have that kind of protection. They said, but in theory, is that you said you're more likely to see them up in the sky in space. Water is not really, their primary thing. It's like they have everything that's up there, but not so much, not always going to be the first choice. Kind of like going to a restaurant and you're not, you said maybe you're not, you can get dessert or a drink, but sometimes you just don't feel like it. You already know what you're going to get and how you want it. So everything is, like everything is just, falls into place. It's like saying that if like someone starts raising hands, for a mission, you never know because when they actually had that Star Trek movie back in the, he said with like Chris Pine, um, they essentially, basically when the captain was like, "Does anyone have any combat training?" and Mr. Sulu volunteered, and all he really had was just actual like fencing, which could be definitely be very helpful, but it's not, what anyone may have actually thought it was going to be. So just kind of consider that. So yeah, so the next video will actually be not exactly about powers, but there are definitely plenty of things associated with this particular area of the comic book realm, and I think it definitely has some bearing on even just choosing, you know, whatever you're gonna said whoever you're gonna have on your team. And so yeah, look forward to that. I'll actually have that up pretty soon. All right, everyone, take care.